Hello. Today we're talking about the Federalism of the United States Constitution. I've had a couple of questions about the participation exercises that I post. They're not graded. They're kind of due whenever you'd like to complete them. I'd like for you to complete them as you watch the corresponding lecture that goes along with it. So once you finish the lecture, please complete the participation assignment. They're not graded, but I am looking at them and I am reading them. Sometimes I'll make a note in there and sometimes I won't. But they are intended to just help you keep up with what we're doing. At the end of the semester, I'll kind of take notes to see who has participated and who hasn't when I'm looking to curve grades at the end of the semester. We don't do extra credit because it's too hard in this virtual world. So this is the way I'm kind of going to be able to look at how I can curve your grade. Those who have been participating and participating well will see a better curve in their grades than others. All right. We have a quiz that's getting posted. It'll be posted on Monday night at midnight, I think. And it's covering all the material that we've talked about so far. It's 10 questions, multiple choice. It should be pretty straightforward and simple. It will expire. You only have a certain amount of time to take it. So please complete that. It will expire. The link will expire for it on Friday. So make sure you take it before then. There are not makeups, so make sure you get it done. Remember, we will have 4 quizzes, and those 4 quizzes together count for 20% of your grade. All right, today we're talking about federalism, the United States Constitution. So what if we forgot about our Constitution and suddenly we used the French Constitution? We still had our same buildings and same politicians in place. We still had the White House and the Capitol building, but it wouldn't be recognizable as American politics. It's not the people or the buildings. It's the rules, the ideas, the narratives that give them life and meaning. Rules don't just drop from the sky. They're written and ready to be implemented. They're created by human beings who want to establish procedures to help them and those like them to get what they want from the system. If you change the rules, you change who is advantaged and disadvantaged by those rules. Our founders wanted rules, but they disagreed about what the basis of our government should be. They had to craft new rules to achieve their goal of a government whose authority came from the people, but whose power was limited as so to preserve the liberty of those people. Rules that fail to meet this test are inconsistent with the narrative of liberty and of self-rule that they're promoting. But rules that did limit self-rule had to be couched in terms that made them seem to be strengthening freedom. So how should laws be made? By whom? Should Parliament be the model where they're with lords and commons, or should there be 2 houses at all? What about an executive branch? Should we have 1 person, several people? How much power should the executive have? How should he or she be chosen? How do we keep it so not 1 person is all powerful? How can the system change with the times but still provide for a stable government? The Constitution's our official rule book here. I think our founders did a pretty tremendous job there. We have 3 branches of government. The government has the power to legislate, make the laws, to administer or execute the laws, and to adjudicate, interpret the laws. So our legislative branch, this is the branch that has the lawmaking power, that it can be created by a ruler, by a party, divined from religion, or made by citizens who have to obey those laws, and that's what we have. A legislature is a body of government that makes the laws. It can be set up differently. It can have 1 chamber or 2. Members can be elected, appointed, hereditary, elected by the people or by some other body. But here in America, we have a bicameral legislature. This is a legislature with 2 chambers, bi meaning 2, bicameral legislature. In the United States, we have our Senate and our House. The House is represented, they're elected every 2 years, and in the Senate, they're elected every 6 years. In Federalist number 10, Madison argued that laws should be made more by representatives than by the people. He rejected the idea of a pure democracy, a small political system where the citizens make and administer their own laws. He recommended a republic, a government where decisions are made through representatives of the people. Like I've mentioned earlier, you don't want to have to go to Washington to vote or to the ballot box to vote every time we want to change the name of a post office. You want to elect somebody to do this for you. This is a republic, a government where decisions are made by representatives of the people. The advantages here are the dangers of factions that we talked about are reduced a little bit, and people running the government are presumably best equipped for this. Madison was really disillusioned with the Articles of Confederacy, so he set up a system where the few have more power than the many, and he justified it by claiming enhanced freedom. And the Constitution talks about this in Article 1, Section 8. It spells out the specific powers of Congress. Anytime when I was working on Capitol Hill, anytime we wrote a new piece of legislation, there's a spot on there that says you have to cite the congressional authority for this new legislation that you're writing. Literally every single time we wrote Article 1, Section 8, the necessary and proper clause. We can do what is necessary and proper. Congress can do what is necessary and proper to carry out its duties. It's been very broadly interpreted by the Supreme Court, and there's few restrictions on it. The House of Representatives is intended to be a representative of the people, the people's house, and the voice of the common man. To be elected, you have to be 25 years old and a citizen for 7 years. There's only 2-year terms, so members are constantly campaigning. They are ousted very frequently according to public whim. But this is intentional. Founders wanted this to be an accessible office and easily to influence based on changes in public opinion. The Senate is a little bit different. You have to be 30 years old and a citizen for 9 years. They are older, wiser, more stable maybe. Their terms last for 6 years, so they're not as easily swayed by changing public sentiment. They were originally not elected by the people. They were elected by members of their state legislature to ensure a higher caliber of citizen and a more aristocratic body. Similar to the British House of Lords, they were admitted by birth or achievement, though, and not by election. This obviously changed later on, and we elect our Senate directly now. What are some alternatives? We could have a unicameral legislature, a legislature with only one chamber. Some advantages there would be that we would have faster lawmaking. It would be more efficient. You wouldn't have to pass laws through both chambers. We'd be more responsive to changes in political opinion. Those are good for democracy. There'd be more of a sense of identity with the government, and implies that the whole country shares the same fundamental interests. But our founders rejected unicameralism. It was too difficult for legislatures to represent more than one set of interests in society. And also, quick legislative responsiveness of a unicameral legislature can be tough. It's better to have safer, smaller units to protect from an abuse of power. George Washington explained bicameral legislation just as one pours one's coffee into a saucer cup to cool it off, we pour legislation into the senatorial saucer to cool it. We used to say that a lot in DC. Each chamber has its passions cooled because you can't just pass something in just the blink of an eye. It has to, it has a little cooling off time because it has to pass through both chambers. A law does. Okay, the executive branch. This is the branch of government that's responsible for putting laws into effect. They execute the law. The United States president, he's not part of the legislature. He can propose, encourage, and veto legislation. He is part of the executive branch. I say he just because we've only had a male president. I'm very proud of Kamala Harris for being a woman vice president, but I'm just going to stick with he just because it's just easier. No offense. Women can do anything. That's what I tell my daughters all the time. But it's just easier to say right now. Okay, so founders were worried about tyrannical power they had just escaped from in England. So how many times? So when they were worried about creating an office of the presidency, they didn't provide for an executive in the Articles of Confederation. They were worried this would threaten their liberty. But the chaos under the Articles made it clear that a stronger government was needed and that an executive was needed. They were worried about this tyranny, and they wondered, how should an executive even should maybe be more than one person? Should he be able to seek re-election? How many times? Should he be elected by the people or by the legislature? If it was more than one person, the power could be divided. If they were elected by Congress, he would be dependent on Congress and fail to provide an adequate check on them in order to curry favor to be reelected. There was no trust in the people, so popular election was suspect. Hamilton wanted the president to serve for life to eliminate the problem of being dependent on Congress or popular will at all. He wanted a more king-like authority. The Constitution ultimately says the president will be a single executive, one person, who can serve an unlimited number of 4-year terms. Obviously, this was amended in 1951 to 2 elected terms. It would be chosen neither by Congress or the people, but instead by the Electoral College. We'll get into that more this semester. The Electoral College is an intermediary body that elects the president. Citizens cast their votes not for the candidates, but for a slate of electors who cast their votes for the candidates about 6 weeks after the general election. This year it was December 14th. And then Congress meets in January to verify that, which we all know a lot about because it was an unusual meeting of the Electoral College this year. A lot of challenges to the election. Article 2 establishes the executive. He should serve a 4-year term, a natural-born citizen of the United States, at least 35 years old, and a resident of the United States for at least 14 years. The vice president will serve if the president cannot, and Congress can determine future succession after that. He has the powers of being commander-in-chief of the military, can grant pardons, and with advice and consent of the Senate can make treaties. A majority of the Senate can appoint ambassadors, consuls, the Supreme Court, etc. He is to have a State of the Union address every year. He can call or adjourn sessions of Congress, receive ambassadors, execute laws, commissions, and officers, and he can be impeached for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Obviously, Trump was impeached in the House about this time last year, and then he was impeached in the House again a couple of weeks ago, but there's been a failure to convict him in the Senate, and we'll talk about that later on as well. They are still going to have another trial in the Senate starting February 8th, I believe, so we will follow that. It's an interesting time to be taking this class. Some possible alternatives to what we have. We could have a presidential system, a government where the executive is chosen independently of the legislature and the branches are separate. The executive would be independent, can impeach him for criminal activity. Or a parliamentary system, a government where the executive is chosen by the legislature from its members and the two branches are merged, where the executive is accountable to the legislature. Parliament can remove executives for political or ideological disagreement. A vote of no confidence in somebody like Bill Clinton would have worked instead of failing to find criminal fault in his actions. Ties to a political party are really strong in a parliamentary system. Okay, then we have the judicial branch. This judicial power is the power to interpret laws and to judge whether a law has been broken. In Federalist number 78, Hamilton called it the least dangerous branch. He said it was the least threatening because the executive and legislature can endanger liberty, but the judiciary must not, so they all must be separate. The executive holds the sword, the legislature commands the purse, and the judiciary has neither force nor will, but merely judgment. They didn't want it to be too powerful or too political, but they appointed judges for life, provided good behavior to preserve them from politics. They said, do what is just and constitutional, not what is popular. The power of judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court to rule on the constitutionality of laws. So in 1803, Marbury versus Madison was where John Marshall ruled that the Supreme Court is the ultimate interpreter of when a law is unconstitutional. This is not an automatic part of lawmaking, though, only if a law is challenged and appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. So what does the Constitution say about the Supreme Court? In Article 3, it's very short. The power is vested in one Supreme Court and inferior courts, lifetime appointment as long as good behavior. But the role of the courts in America has really been left to be defined by Congress and by the courts themselves. So what are some possible alternatives? Legislative supremacy. This is an alternative to judicial review, which is the acceptance of legislative acts as the final law of the land, which underlies British politics. There's no written constitution. But in America, we have the separation of powers. We have, our founders were so smart. The separation of powers and the checks and balances that we have are just really amazing creations. Separation of power is the institutional arrangement that assigns judicial, executive, and legislative powers to different persons or groups and thereby limiting the powers of each. There was a French philosopher who said it's like putting political power into the set of one hands is like putting all eggs in one basket. If one goes bad, they all go bad. But if the power is divided, one can go bad and the other two will be okay. And checks and balances, similarly, is the principle that allows government to form some sort of exercise some form of control over the others. It ensures that no branch can exercise power tyrannically. The president can veto Congress. Congress can override a veto. The Supreme Court can declare law unconstitutional. Congress can amend the Constitution with help from the states. And so everybody can check each other. It's really great that the founders have figured out how to do that. In Federalist 51, Madison wrote, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But if angels were to govern men, you'd have neither external nor internal controls on government that would be necessary. But we're not angels, and we are not governed by angels. Human nature is flawed. Humans can be greedy, corrupt, ambitious, and precautions must be taken. Separation of powers is an easy thing for the founders. The checks and balances is a little more difficult. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition, said Madison. What's the Constitution say? All right, Article 1, bicameral legislature. Both houses must agree and check each other. The presidential veto can check Congress. Congress can override a veto and check the president. Congress can impeach a president or Supreme Court and check them. Article 2 says the president can recommend laws, appoint judges, but only after they're confirmed by the Senate, and grant pardons, which checks the judiciary. They are the commander-in-chief, but only Congress can declare war. In Article 3, the Supreme Court, talking about the Supreme Court, judicial review is established in Marbury versus Madison. There's a check on legislative and executive branches. Congress can amend the Constitution and check the judiciary. So really what I'm getting at here is that no one branch can act independently, but also none is dependent on the others. This is the separation of checks and balances that's uniquely American. It's clear in our Constitution that national government trumps state government, though. The narrative of shared power really has allowed both sides to come together around this concept. And the effects of federalism we see today are things like income taxes paid to the national government that parcels out money to the states. Even when we have a state law, the national government can still sometimes enforce its own will, like a drinking law. A state can decide on a minimum drinking age, but the states can just, they're supposed to be able to decide on their own minimum drinking age, but the federal government said they were going to withhold 5% of federal highway funds until they had all established a minimum drinking age of 21, under the guise of making roads safer. So they said, we're not going to give you this money until you do what we say, but you can do what you want. So what does the Constitution say? There are the enumerated powers of Congress, Article 1, Section 8, congressional powers that are specifically named in the Constitution. They're the necessary and proper clause, which is the constitutional authorization for Congress to make any laws required to be carried out by its powers. It's also called the elastic clause because the Supreme Court has interpreted it so broadly. The supremacy clause, the constitutional declaration in Article 6 that the Constitution and laws are made under the provision of the supreme law of the land. And then the 10th Amendment that says all powers not given to the national government are reserved to the states. But necessary and proper clause makes it hard to see what's really withheld from the national government. You could really get into that a lot in law school. So there's two views of federalism here. You have two views, dual federalism and cooperative federalism. Dual federalism is a federal system under which national and state governments are responsible for separate policy areas. State and national government were supposed to be two contained layers, each separate and carrying out functions independently, but each were supposed to be supreme. There was a formal distinction in the Constitution and perhaps accurate judicial interpretation for about 100 years. And then cooperative federalism, the federal system under which national and state governments share responsibilities for most domestic areas. Instead of two layers of a cake, their cooperative federalism is like they're swirled together like chocolate and vanilla in a marble cake. They're interdependent, but the required cooperation of the others to get things done. It's a partnership, but the dominant partner is usually the national government. So some possible alternatives to federalism, a unitary system would be a government where all power is centralized. This is how Great Britain is. What if the national government could suspend the state legislature in Alabama during segregation to run the state from D.C.? It's impossible in the United States, but not in Britain, except for in the chaos following the Civil War. Then you have the confederal system. So much like the Articles of Confederation, they wanted to have the localities control everything. The confederal system is where the local units hold all the power. This is like United Nations, the European Union, where the central government is dependent for their existence, but local government is sovereign. What difference does federalism make? Federalism gave the founders a government that takes effective action, restores economic stability, and regulates disputes among the states, but also allows some autonomy in the states and a narrative that they perhaps have more power than they do. Gives flexibility to preserve local standards and solves problems at levels in which they occur. Hi. Like, for instance, a traffic law or a housing code or a school policy. There are some disadvantages, meaning that you could have a different punishment for different crimes that makes it difficult to gauge the consequences of behavior across states. Like, for example, marijuana. Like, the laws are very different in all the states. And so maybe if you are in one state, your law is a certain way, but you crossed a state line and now you don't realize that the law has changed. That can make things difficult. States also compete for industry. This is called smokestack chasing. You can bid against each other to attract industry. And governors who land enterprises are typically rewarded at the voting booth. So there's a reason for states to keep competing. Federalism, though, has really proven to be flexible and effective. Germany, Canada, Mexico, Australia, Switzerland, these are all other federal systems. But as historic events occur, the demands and levels of government change, including federalism versus state and government, state versus federal, and growing in size. We make more demands on our government than were made in Washington's time. Our country has grown bigger, more industrial, more urban, and more technical. So we expect and need more from our government than we did when it was founded. We want our government to protect our rights, but now that's more than just the first 10 amendments. We want economic security in old age. We want a minimum standard of living. We want safe highways, crime-free neighborhoods. Liberals really tend to believe in a strong central government to solve social problems like discrimination and poverty. And conservatives tend to think that big government creates more problems than it solves. Like anti-federalists, they want more local and state government. Okay, so John Marshall, he really strengthened the constitutional power, and the power of the national government. In 1819, McCulloch versus Maryland, this was a question of whether Congress could charter a bank and if Maryland could tax that bank. The Supreme Court ruled in 1819, confirming the supremacy of national government over state government. In 1824, Gibbons versus Ogden, the Supreme Court ruled that establishing national authority over interstate business, interpreted really broadly to include almost any kind of business. This is another class in law school, guys, but just hang with me. The Civil War kind of established the national dominance of the states. One of the largest issues of the Civil War was to resolve the question of national versus state supremacy. And then nullification is the declaration by a state that a federal law is void within its borders. The southern states tried to maintain their own narrative by invoking this, and then succeeding from the United States to reject the national authority, but the Union victory showed that states did not retain sovereignty under the Constitution. Under the New Deal, the Supreme Court maintained an anti-regulation stance, but the president berated the court for striking down programs and these programs. And then a public opinion really ended up backing the New Deal. And so Supreme Court had a change of heart. And once established as constitutional, the New Deal had really defined the purpose of American government and the scope of state and national powers. It really strengthened the federal government. Social Security was born during the New Deal and a lot of other national programs that were designed to get America back to work and back on its feet. Federalism today, it is a renegotiated compromise between advocates of strong national government on one hand and advocates of state power on the other. If a party dominates in the federal government for a long time, its members become accustomed to looking there to accomplish their aims. The minority party then looks to the states, and they tend to fight to have decisions made in the arena where they are most likely to prevail. Devolution is the transfer of powers and responsibilities from the federal government to the states. Most questions of contemporary federalism involve the national government trying to influence how the states and localities go about providing goods and services and regulating behaviors that have traditionally been within their jurisdictions. Some policies, like Social Security, are easy to administer at national levels. Others, like changing education policy, remain under state authority and are difficult to be altered in D.C. What do you have? So how the national government tries to influence the states? What is in your mouth? What is that? Come here. The character of rules. Will rules and regulations issued be broad enough to allow states flexibility or narrow and specific enough to guarantee that the policy is executed as DC wishes? What are the costs of the rules? Will it be paid for by the national government? If so, how much will the cost cover? Yeah? What's in your mouth? Nothing? Just your teeth? Okay. There are 4 general congressional strategies for influencing the states. The first is to have no government influence, no instructions provided, states can act as they want. The second is a categorical grant, federal funds provided for a specific purpose and restricted by detailed instructions, regulations, and compliance standards. If the state complies with the requirements, the federal money is released. If the state does not comply, it does not get the money. This is a lot of what I do as a lobbyist is telling states kind of when they are able to apply for certain grants. Federal grants make up more than about 1/4 of all state and local spending, but it comes with a lot of paperwork, a lot of regulations. You did have something in there. Members of Congress like them because they like to receive credit for grant programs, and it makes it popular for them to bring money back home. The third is a block grant. This is federal funds that are provided for a broad purpose and unrestricted by detailed requirements and regulations. States have considerable freedom in using these broad policy areas. Congress resists block grants because they fear states will kind of pursue their own agendas instead of what Congress intends. And it's impossible to control how a state deals with a program under a block grant. A member also can't claim credit for these programs. Yeah. And then fourth are unfunded mandates. These are federal orders that mandate that states operate and pay for programs created at the national level. Come here. Stop eating this. So these impose specific policy requirements on states, but instead of providing a way to pay for these activities, they just force states to comply by threatening criminal or civil penalties if they don't follow their direction. An example here is the Real ID Act. We're all having to get our real IDs to required for doing business with federal agencies and going through airports. It is an unfunded mandate. They're saying they're going to fine you for not getting your real ID, but they're not giving you money to actually do it. That's an example. Okay, so the continuing tension between the state and national government. The current status of federalism is a mix of narratives about returning the powers to the states and of new national incentives like healthcare and education and environment. Coercive federalism is when the states are pressured to adopt national solutions to their local problems with minimum state input. Members of Congress are elected locally and have primary loyalties to their constituencies, not a national audience. National inaction. I used to work for a member of Congress who always said, when are we going to do something? It's really left a policy vacuum being filled with state policy initiatives. So to amend the Constitution, if the Constitution is a rule book, its capacity to be changed over time is critical to it remaining a viable political document. Amendability is the provision for the Constitution to be changed so as to adapt to new circumstances. Over 10,000 amendments have been introduced, but the Constitution has only been formally amended 27 times. The recent calls for amendments are banning abortion, banning gay marriage, banning flag burning, permitting prayer in schools, usually very partisan camp divides here. The Democrats typically believe that change is inevitable and the Constitution is a living, breathing, flexible document that can have small alterations. Republicans, we usually think that we're usually suspicious of change and believe that founders' work does not need to be tampered with by unelected judges. They can change in fundamental ways, but preferably by amendment. Article 5 spells out the confusing process for amending the Constitution. You either have to propose by 2/3 vote of the House and Senate, or when 2/3 of the states request a constitutional convention, it has to be approved by either the legislatures of 3/4 of the states or by conventions of 3/4 of the states. It's super complicated, and that's on purpose. Some states make it harder to amend their own constitution. 12 states require that amendments pass in more than one session of the legislature in successive years in order to amend it. Some states make it easier. They give citizens a substantial role in the process through a referenda and initiative. But public opinion can be fickle, and maybe we don't want the Constitution to respond easily to a whim. Like, for instance, the California Constitution has been amended more than 500 times instead of being subject to ordinary legislation. Is the fundamental importance of a constitution trivialized by cluttering it with that many additions so that it's hard to deal with in other ways? The United States Constitution has weathered the test of time for two reasons. First, it's not too detailed and not too explicit. And second, it guards equally against that extreme facility, which would render the Constitution mutable, and the extreme difficulty, which might perpetuate its discovered flaws. Benjamin Franklin said he'd created a republic, madam, if you can keep it. But the Constitution only allows citizens the slimmest roles in keeping the republic. In fact, it profoundly limits citizen participation. Founders really wanted it this way. They didn't trust human beings to know their best interests or to handle power without being corrupted. They wanted popular power to serve as a potential check on the elected leaders, but they wanted to impose strict checks on popular power as well. The Constitution was the Republic's insurance against the chaos and instability. There are three formal mechanisms of direct democracy at the state level. The first is an initiative. This is citizen petitions to place a proposal or a constitutional amendment on the ballot and be adopted or rejected by a majority vote, bypassing the legislature. If it receives a majority vote, it's adopted and becomes law. So this is the way they make changes to state laws in California a lot. The second is a referendum, an election where bills passed by the state legislature is submitted to voters for approval. A lot of states require constitutional amendments to do this. When I was a voter in Virginia, a lot of almost every election, we had some sort of a referendum on there, and we had to look at, are we giving this much money to the new school districts and things like that. Recall elections, the third, is a vote to remove a government official from office. This requires petitions, generally about 25% of the electorate. They're infrequent but notable. The removal of Gray Davis as the governor in California, the recall of Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin, things like that. Like it happens, but they're very infrequent. Okay, our questions that I'm going to post today. So this is just a think about question, and then I'm going to ask, why do we think the founders chose to structure the three branches of government as they did? Do we think our Constitution has allowed it to be changed with the times? Should it be more or less flexible than it currently is? And then, do you think the Constitution fosters or limits participation in the government, our citizen participation in the government? I'm going to post those. Just give me, again, I don't want researched answers. I just want to know kind of what you think. Like if we were sitting in class right now, you would raise your hand and tell me what you think. So just a quick, brief participation sort of grade. Why did the founders choose to structure the three branches of government the way they did? Has the flexibility of the Constitution allowed it to change with times? Should it be more or less flexible than it already is? And does the Constitution foster or limit citizen participation in the government? I'll post those with our lecture for today, and your quiz will be up Monday night and is due on Friday. Always email me with any questions, annalyrits@gmail.com. And this is it for your lectures this week. You just have one lecture and a quiz, and we will be back next week. Take care.